You're a Democrat. You're running for governor in a state that has not elected a Democrat in a very long time. Why are you running?
Well, it's a fair question. I'm running because I want to make a difference in people's lives. I remember when the Utah Democratic Party came and asked me to run. I thought they were going to ask me to, make a contribution or give a talk somewhere. I was really surprised when they asked me to run for governor, and I'll be candid. I laughed at them and threw them out of my office. But as time went on, and I thought about how many people in Utah are still struggling to get by, despite all the successes that we've had in recent years, and some of the challenges that I see that we're not grappling with respect to our environment and with respect to public education, and now more recently the coronavirus crisis. I think that I can make a difference, and I am prepared to be an effective governor and can do the job. So look, I think that I have a message, and I believe that there are more and more Utahns that are receptive to it.
Chris, I think it'd be useful for you to introduce yourself to those watching and listening to this, as to who you are, your background, and also why you think you're qualified to be Utah's next governor.
Sure. Well, thank you for the opportunity. My great-great-grandfather led a wagon train of 1,500 pioneers to the Salt Lake Valley back in 1847. I'm about as homegrown as you can get as an immigrant to the state of Utah. And he later went on to become the Utah public school superintendent. He was the Speaker of the House. He was also the first chairman of Zions Bank, and also a great faith leader, the third president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I don't know where all the Zions Bank money went, because I was raised with very limited income on the west side of Salt Lake in West Valley City. I got my first job when I was about 10 or 11 years old, picking up trash at a strip mall. Worked my way through college at the University of Utah, and eventually became a lawyer. I worked in the Obama administration, setting up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the CFPB. I also worked at the Department of Defense, helping lead the Pentagon's efforts to protect military service members from tricks and traps in our financial services products. I think that I'm qualified to be governor because I've worked at the highest levels of the federal government. And I also believe that I've spent my entire career fighting for ordinary families to get a fair shake in our society. And frankly, I think that we need a little bit of that here in the state of Utah. I know that we're a conservative state, but it's not such a unreasonable thing to have a little bit of balance. Good competition works well, not just in the marketplace, but also in government. If we don't have balance, give and take, then there's more and more chance that the government is going to become guided by party insiders, privileged elites, and even sometimes ideologues that have the government drift further and further away from the overwhelming benefit of the public. So I believe that I have something to add to the government, and it'd be hopefully a bit of a breath of fresh air in our state politics.
You're running against a candidate who came out of the primary with a very slim margin of victory, but won the primary nonetheless against what I think is fair to be described as a political institution in the state of Utah, in the Huntsman family and John Huntsman. Were you rooting for either one of these candidates? I mean, either one of these, either John or Spencer could have won that primary. As you watch that primary play out, what were your thoughts on the eventual outcome with Cox winning the nomination, and what were your thoughts on the general tone and tenor of that campaign?
Well, both the lieutenant governor and the ambassador are gentlemen. They're good guys. I like both of them individually and respect them. I do believe that there's room in our state for a bit of a change in direction right now. And both of them represent the same the same establishment that has created some of the problems we're facing right now. I'll just, for example, in 2016, the public overwhelmingly voted for 3 ballot measures on Medicaid expansion, medical marijuana, and fair legislative redistricting, anti-gerrymandering, only to have the state legislature and the lieutenant governor and the Herbert Cox administration rewrite those ballot measures and substitute their judgment for the will of the public. That's the same kind of, a privileged insider approach that we've had for too long in this state. I'm going to be an advocate that listens to ordinary people across the state and tries to implement their will. And just one more thing, all three of those ballot measures, those are primarily Democratic positions across the country. If the state of Utah can pass those three ballot measures, it's not such a crazy thing that a conservative, reasonably conservative, moderate business law professor like me could win this state in a statewide election. I'm hoping that folks will give me a chance and not just look at the R or the D next to my opponent's name, whether that's Lieutenant Governor Cox or had it been Ambassador Huntsman. I think that it's time for change. It's time for change.
Up until the end of last month, Huntsman was rather openly considering a write-in campaign for governor. What were he eventually obviously decided not to go that route. What was your thinking around that? Were you like raising your hand saying, hey, I'm running? Cox has an opponent here.
Well, a little bit of that. It's certainly hard for me to get coverage in the press, and I also find that it's that a lot of the donors in the state, they don't want to risk the ire of who they perceive to be the heir apparent. I get that. It's natural. It's been a long time since a Democrat has won, but that doesn't mean that it has to continue to always be that way. I think that there are a lot of Utahns who look at President Trump, for example, and see in him someone who's not actually that good for business. He's not at all a positive role model for our children, and he doesn't reflect traditional Utah values. Of all of the candidates on the Republican side of the aisle, I'm the only Democrat, I'm the only candidate who is not endorsing the president. And I think that that's a real alternative. Had the ambassador jumped in, I would have welcomed him to the race and done the same sort of thing that I'm doing now. Try to speak truth, share my message, and hope that the voters of Utah decide that, like me, I believe it's time for change.
I promise this is the last question along these lines, but given kind of the uphill battle that at least it's perceived that you have, I think it's worth asking, because I do want to go deep on kind of your positions and your view for the future of Utah and the direction you'd like to take this state in the future. But how do you win this campaign? In all sincerity, how do you win a campaign for governor as a Democrat with, and I asked this question because on the night that it was declared that Spencer Cox had won the Republican nomination, it was as though he'd won the election for governor. That's the way that was treated. And so I'd love for you, because I think a lot of people are watching this and saying, hey, maybe I do want an alternative to the Republican Party. Maybe I do want an alternative to Spencer Cox. But how do I throw my support and my time and my energy behind a losing cause? So I think, as I was preparing to interview you and getting a lot of feedback from people throughout the community, the main question just over and over again is like, how does he win?
Well, the first step is that people have got to stop focusing on exclusively that question, especially a couple of days after Labor Day. Right? Traditionally, American political campaigns don't even get started until 2 days ago. And yet everybody is already declaring victory for the lieutenant governor. That's a mistake. We need to, as a society, have deeper, more thoughtful conversations about policy and not just follow the results of the last election. And I understand that Utahns have traditionally for many years voted for the Republican Party, but it hasn't always been so. I remember when Scott Matheson Sr., the last Democratic governor of the state of Utah, was around. He was a very successful governor and was much beloved. Since then, we've drifted off a bit in terms of the Democratic Party, but frankly, I believe that the Republican Party has been leaving more and more Utahns. I just saw a very interesting analysis by a professor, Jacob Rue at BYU, pointing out that the data seems to suggest that for the first time in 40 years, the precincts that surround Brigham Young University are about to flip back Democrat. That hasn't happened before because times are changing. There are many progressive members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and there are many people who are moving into the state, and there also is changing demographics. There are more and more Latino and Latina voters, and also other Pacific Islander and Asian voters, and all of them are not well represented by the Republican party. So what we've got to stop doing is pretending that one side has a monopoly on power. The other thing that I'll point out here is that when commentators, armchair pundits, reporters, other folks say that that's the case, they're not just, it's not just disrespectful to me. That's fine. It's okay with that. It's disrespectful to voters. Voters have the right to actually get their vote counted and be heard and have a real robust campaign and discuss who actually is in the best position to lead the state forward. And I think that if you match my experience, line by line with the lieutenant governor, it actually matches up pretty well. And I think I'm on the right side of a bunch of issues that a majority of Utahns support where he is not. So I have a legitimate place in this race, and I'll thank everybody to give me a chance.
There seems to be three kind of major issues overshadowing or following this election cycle. The first being COVID-19 and the federal government's response to COVID-19 and also the state of Utah's response to COVID-19. Given that you're running for governor and you're running against Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox, who served as the chair of the coronavirus task force here in the state of Utah, how would you rate the state of Utah's response to COVID-19?
B-. Some things that have been reasonably positive. We're lucky that our total fatality rate is relatively low. I think that has a lot to do with our overall health level in Utah. We're a healthy people. We're active. We're physically fit, and we have done some things right. I don't want to cast all aspersions. There have been some challenges too. I'm not convinced that the financial stewardship has entirely been there, using all the resources effectively. But the biggest criticism I have is that, look, about 30 states, more than 30 states around the country have imposed statewide mask mandates. Most of the countries of the world who have been more successful at getting their virus under control have recognized that masks, although they're inconvenient, they're not a lot of fun. If we're not capable of engaging in social distancing, we need to put masks on to take care of one another, to love our neighbors, and the science all points in that direction. So look, we need to have masks on, and the counties that are wearing masks and have a mandate, like Salt Lake County, are being much more effective at getting their curves down than some of the counties that are not. So that's one clear distinction. I would listen to public health experts on that. It's not just good for public health, though. It's also good for business. Businesses right now are struggling, especially many small businesses that don't do well in a virtual environment. Places like restaurants, theaters and music venues, places where people gather need to be able to do so in a way where there's some minimum level of safety. Grocery stores, another great example. And the folks that are refusing to wear masks are hurting those businesses. That's a different direction. Looking forward, I think that we did not do a good enough job trying to get low interest rates right now, bonding for shovel-ready infrastructure projects to spur our economy. I also think we could have done a little better job helping out landlords and tenants, making sure that we don't have as many evictions. We're also looking at a lot of residential home mortgage foreclosures that are very troubling to me. And I think that we haven't done enough job making sure that everybody has the personal protective equipment, like things like N95 masks, and with wide availability to keep people as safe as possible. So there have been some positive things, but overall, I think that there's a lot of room for improvement.
Would you have reopened schools?
I do think that reopening schools is one of the toughest decisions we've had to make. I support the governor's order to have masks. I think that I probably would have tried to do it a little bit slower, tried to focus first on getting the youngest children back to school first, because they have the hardest time doing distance learning. They also appear, based on the science, to have the best immune response to the virus. I think that we probably should have used smaller pods of students in staggered time periods to try to decrease the potential for spread of the disease. Some school districts are doing pretty well at that. Others, I think, a little bit less so. But we also have to recognize that kids need to go back to school and parents need the support with childcare. So I would have reopened schools, but I probably would have been a little bit more cautious and a little bit more tactical in the way that we did so.
When you think about the long-term education here in the state of Utah, and that being a big focus, always seems to be a big focus every election year on improving education here in the state of Utah. Would you think it'd be wise for the government to invest more on the infrastructure side of things so that even COVID-19 or no COVID-19, remote learning is more powerful, more sustainable than it currently is?
Clint, I absolutely think so. I think that there are a number of different ways that our public school system is tragically underfunded. You know, we have the lowest per pupil spending in any state in America, and have for decades now. And that bears itself out, not just in, you know, in terms of the point that you raised of lack of technology, resources, and infrastructure to teach in alternative environments, but it also means class sizes that are overcrowded and teachers that are distracted and can't spot kids who are struggling. It means that we don't have enough counselors and nurses to take care of the kids who really need help. You know, we have one of the highest teen suicide rates in America. I think that's actually tied to our shockingly underfunded public school counseling networks. I also would add too, you know, at the most basic level, 1 in 4 children in our state can't read in the 4th grade. You know, what does that say about how we're setting up our children to be successful in the future? I think, you know, part of our challenge is we have big families in our state, and I'm okay with that. I support that. I have 3 kids of my own, and a 4th would be just a blessing, and I'd be happy to have them. But the fact is that even though we have large families, every child deserves the best opportunity to succeed, and we need to come together to provide the resources to give them those opportunities. It's something that we're failing at the state level. Utah should be able to fund our schools better than New Mexico, than Mississippi, other states that have much, much lower incomes than we do and much less diversified economies than we do. We're not doing a good enough job, and I have no expectation that that's going to change in a Cox administration. Why? Because, well, look, the Republican Party has had decades to try to get this right and has not got the job done. I'm going to do a better job. I'm going to fight for those kids. I'm going to fight for our public schools to provide the best opportunities to help our children succeed.
The second issue that appears to be hovering over this election and the country is the social unrest around the social justice movement, around Black Lives Matter, spurred by the killing of George Floyd. And we've seen those protests here in Utah, in particular in Salt Lake, there in Provo. We've seen it, I think, you know, in a number of places throughout the state. A lot of the call that we're hearing there is around defunding the police reform. Where do you stand on those 2 issues? I mean, and I'm actually, you know, to be completely honest, I'm not clear what is meant when defund police is said. I think sometimes it means exactly what is being said, and sometimes it doesn't. So where do you stand on? You know, I'm not asking particularly on Black Lives Matter. That seems like an easy one to support. It seems easy to be able to say Black Lives Matter. But where do you stand on police reform or defunding the police?
Well, so first off, I do want to say the words Black Lives Matter because I think there are many people who want to hear that. And I think that Black lives do matter. That word, those terms mean different things for different people. I'm not necessarily endorsing some broader protest movement or anything along those lines. I just want my Black and African-American friends and neighbors to know that I care about them and that their lives matter to me. And those words are important. But that being said, on your question about defunding the police, look, I don't support defunding the police, and I don't. I think that we need law and order in our state, and we need to make sure that I don't support. I support protesting. You know, people have a constitutional right to assemble and petition the government for change, but I don't support destruction of property or violent protest. I believe more in the tradition of protest of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. of nonviolent protest, maybe civil disobedience, but this violence, I don't support that at all. And as far as police reform, I do believe that there is some real opportunities for us to try to reform policing in our country, to try to make a decrease conflict de-escalation. Implicit bias training is useful in businesses and government and also in police forces to try and help us recognize when maybe our thumb is on the scale or we don't notice that we're doing something that might be prejudicial or discriminatory. And I also worry that sometimes our police officers are not cared for. One of the things that surprised me is that both the Fraternal Order of Police, the police union, and the NAACP have come out and talked about making sure that police officers have mental health resources and counseling available. Some of our police officers go through terribly violent situations, cleaning up after multiple homicides, and then you have to go right back on the job without ever talking about their feelings and trying to get the counseling that might help them approach their job with bright eyes and an open heart to protect and serve all of us in the way that we're hoping for. I do recognize, though, there are some police officers that are being too violent. I don't know we don't know all the facts, but just a few days ago, a mother called a Salt Lake City police, the police department, to get help with a 13-year-old child who was acting out, has autism or is on the autistic spectrum. And the police showed up, and instead of helping, they shot the kid. And he was unarmed, apparently. It's hard for me to understand how that was the best outcome. Obviously, there's still an investigation to be done, not trying to prejudge that. But I do recognize that the police cannot shoot people without just a cause, without self-defense. So we do have opportunities for reform, and I'm going to be trying to look to do that in cooperation with the police officers union, as well as civil rights activists and community policing advocates, to try to find compromise ground to maintain law and order while we're having justice in our society.
Well, as I mentioned, there's been a number of protests here in the state of Utah. I think they've been largely, if not entirely, peaceful here in the state. Where you look at like Portland and some of these other places, maybe they haven't been as peaceful as here in the state of Utah, right? Or around this issue, and a protest that popped up, and I'd love to get your take on this. In the other direction was the political cartoonist Pat Bagley. For the Salt Lake Tribune, put out a cartoon that depicted an officer going in to get an x-ray. And when the x-ray was exposed, it showed like a hooded, like a member of the KKK, like a hood, right? Basically calling this particular police officer in the cartoon a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And that obviously set off a lot of condemnations from a lot of folks. I believe the Speaker of the House has condemned it. A lot of the police, various associations that have condemned this. What is and there was a protest again in the opposite direction of the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm actually a board member, full disclosure, of the Salt Lake Tribune. So I've been following this closely as well. What was your take on Pat's cartoon?
Well, first off, I think that Pat Bagley is a state treasure. Sometimes I agree with his cartoons or the implication of his cartoons. Sometimes I don't. But overall, I think that it's important for us to have provocateurs, people that make you think, and editorial cartoons are designed to do that. That being said, with the specific respect to the specific cartoon in question, the thing that I took away from the cartoon is that there are some examples of some white supremacist groups and individuals that are attempting to infiltrate police forces. Now, that's not to say that every police officer is a member of the KKK. That's just obviously not true. I would take exception to that too. And I'm not going to take a position one way or the other about this particular cartoon. I do think that it's important for us to recognize that there have been in the past members of the KKK who have in fact joined police forces in various places around the country. I worry that there may be some white supremacists who are joining some of our police forces here in the state of Utah. I think that that's rare, but it's something that we need to be aware of and keep an eye on. Because, and the reason that's a problem is that we rely on our police forces to provide equal justice under the law for all people. It's a critical function of society and of the police. So we can't have the police favoring one background over another. So it's worth. I think it's worth taking a look at that cartoon. I think maybe a little more of it has been made of than should be. But I also recognize that we need to be careful about not allowing white supremacists to infiltrate the police forces of the state. And I frankly, I think that the Fraternal Order of the Police would agree with me about that.
So the final thing that seems to be hovering over this election, and again, the country, is we're going to elect a president in November. And it's Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. As you look at that race, and as you, obviously you're a Democrat, as you look at, the way that is impacting so many things currently, and the way, the election that's coming up, and the way that it's being talked about, the way that it's being covered, and the way that it's dividing this country, if we can just be honest. What advice would you have for Utahns as we navigate this until November? And are you endorsing Joe Biden? I don't know if you've said that entirely.
Yeah, couple things here. First off, I do think that the division that we have in our society is getting a bit poisonous. And I worry about our ability to come together and find compromise and to get along with one another. And frankly, it's one of the things that I find troubling about the president. I realize that many Utahns are going to vote for President Trump, but I just ask you to bear in mind, is he doing everything that he can to be a peacemaker, to try to reach across party lines and represent all Americans? I feel like too often he tends to put gas on the fire of our divisions. But it's not just him, and it's also not just from the Republican side. You know, we have our own firebrands in the Democratic Party. I'm doing the best that I can to try to forcefully and persuasively advocate my case for change in the state of Utah, which is a relatively moderate vision for the state, still fiscally conservative, but trying to be a bit more inclusive, fund our public schools. Something we haven't talked about that's very important to me is air pollution, a real challenge along the Wasatch Front, especially down the road as we grow more and more. But I will say I have endorsed Joe Biden, and I realize that that's not going to be the most popular choice in the state. But as I look at our future, he strikes me as a better role model for our children. Is he perfect? No. Is he the candidate that most Utahns are going to get behind? I don't know. But when I look at my own heart, my own conscience, I think that he's a better role model for our children and will steer us on the path towards prosperity and decency, and hopefully heal some of the wounds and division that we're facing in our society. I also think that the technology industry has a role to play in this. One of the challenges that we face in our society is that as more and more of us are fragmenting off into different technological realms, whether that's Facebook groups or your Twitter following or pockets of Instagram, it's harder for us to reach across this logarithmically driven gulf that's being created between us to try to find common ground with our fellow Utahns and fellow Americans. It's something that we've got to think about and start to make progress on. It's something I hope to do. I want folks to know that although I am a Democrat, I plan to be a governor if I'm elected for all Utahns, and would govern with humility and respect, recognizing that a majority of Utahns are very conservative, want low taxes, and want to have a family-oriented government. That's the kind of leader that I aspire to be, and hope that folks will give me a chance.
Well, speaking of tech and the kind of the growth that we're seeing in the state of Utah, in large part due to the growth of the tech industry, in particular along the Wasatch Front, which is causing all sorts of challenges, right? There are challenges that come along with success. Traffic challenges, air pollution challenges, rising housing cost challenges. And the concern I've always had with the challenges that this success has and what the challenge that this success brings is that we'll start to price people out. And the Silicon Slopes might rise while the rest of Utah falls, or even remain stagnant. And so what would you do as governor as you think about that in ensuring that all of Utah rises together and not just one particular industry, which again, I obviously think it's been good for the state of Utah, given the role I play here. But I would not ignore the challenges that come with the success that the technology industry has seen, again, with rising housing costs, which is a major problem, and growth in and spikes in air pollution because of the growth on traffic on I-15. And so how do we ensure that all of Utah rises and not just one industry?
Well, it's a great question. First off, I want to say that I'm a big fan of Silicon Slopes, and as I travel around the country, in my job and around the state, I think that the technology industry has done a lot for Utah, and I'm very proud of it. And I want you and your listeners to know that I will be a champion for that industry. For example, I want to try to revitalize our public school system to create a real and reach out to technology businesses to create a pipeline of education straight from our high schools through our community colleges, technical colleges, and universities directly into our tech businesses to make sure you've got the data scientists and the coders and the biologists for some of emerging industries that you need to grow and thrive. So that's the first step, is to make sure that the Silicon Slopes that we're building continues to grow and have a cutting edge against its competition. A couple mountain ranges over in California, but also in China, in Japan, and Europe, and other places around the world. Second, we've got to make sure that some of the living challenges that we see in San Francisco and San Jose don't crop up here. Also, Seattle. I think one of the things we need to make sure we're doing is building an affordable housing sector that keeps pace with the Silicon Slopes growth, and that means we've got to make sure that our zoning, that we're zoning for livable, walking neighborhoods that have apartments and homes that people can afford. And another thing I think we need to do is make sure we're taking advantage of not just Lehigh, Sandy Draper, maybe downtown Salt Lake, but also some of the more geographically distant areas, developing opportunities to do remote working with a little more limited commuting. And then with respect to air pollution, I'm really disappointed that we haven't more quickly moved for wholesale adoption of Tier 3 gasoline, which decreases air pollution in the short term. But looking to the medium term, we've got to create the right incentives for plug-in hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles to transition quickly. We have some geographic challenges in this state with our natural inversions, but also with ozone pollution in the summer. And we cannot wait for the market to get to electric vehicles any old time. We've got to get ahead of that. Otherwise, we're going to be poisoning ourselves. More asthma, more lung disease, lung cancer, all of the host of diseases that affect quality of life associated with too much pollution in our air. We've got to get ahead of that. I think that clean, green energy is one of the approaches that will help us get to where we need to go.
Finally, Chris, given that it's 2020, and of course, our state, and particularly northern Utah, where you live, up in the Salt Lake City area, experienced massive wind. What was it, 99 miles per hour, maybe even reached 100 miles per hour. And I saw on social media that this wind knocked over like a 100-year-old tree in front of your house. How are you and the family? I can't believe that.
I love that tree. I'm going to miss it. But look, don't worry about me. I've got a lovely old home, and I'm much more worried about just, about 3 blocks away from me, there's a homeless encampment. There are people that right now don't have anywhere to go. More and more of them are infected with the coronavirus. Many of them don't have a place that they can use the bathroom. And those are some of the challenges that we haven't managed to talk about today. My family's going to be just fine. I'm running in this race to try to serve the public, and not just the privileged party elites, the insiders, but everybody. The children that aren't getting the education they deserve, the seniors who are struggling to breathe in our inversions and ozone pollution, and the homeless folks on the street that have been left behind. My opponent, who, as I've said, is a nice guy, I like him, but not only was he the coronavirus task force he was also the head of the homelessness task force. And as I drive by the homeless encampment not far from my street, from my home, I worry that we have not grappled with those challenges and are headed down a path that has some of the worst aspects of San Francisco, which has that challenge, but also some of the worst characteristics of Texas, which has too many low-income jobs with no benefits or health insurance. We need to forge our own better path in this state that cares for all of us, but also has that vibrant and successful economy that we're all looking for. I think I have the dynamism, the excitement, and the energy to be that leader that Utah needs. I hope you'll give me a chance. I hope that the Silicon Slopes leaders across the state will recognize we need a breath of fresh air in the governor's office. I'm hoping that you'll give me the chance to be that.
Chris, thank you so much for coming on. I hope we'll see you again along the campaign trail, and best of luck.
Hey, Clint, it's an honor to serve, and I really appreciate everything that you're doing at Silicon Slopes.